Good morning, Year 12. Hope you're all very well and that you've had a lovely Christmas with your families and you've managed to relax. In terms of what to expect for the next few weeks, I'm going to be doing these videos for you, so just my normal PowerPoint of what I would normally show you in class with my voice over it, trying to explain the concepts to you. Please, if you have any questions, please post them onto either the Teams chat or email me directly. I'm happy to answer any questions. Don't just struggle, because I'm still here as your teacher to help you. So once a week as well, we're going to be doing live lessons, so look out for the invite for those. Our first one will be next week, so I look forward to hearing from you all then. And just in terms of these kinds of lessons, just treat it as a normal lesson, so have your pen, your paper, your textbooks with you. You can pause me at any time. So this is Unit 1, and in Unit 1 we've covered the cognitive approach, social approach, learning approach and biological approach. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take those approaches to explain 3 different types of behaviour. So one is aggression, which we have looked at. The second is consumer behaviour, which we're going to be looking at today. And then the third one is gender. And I'm going to be doing cognitive with you, and then we'll move on to social. Mr. Martin's going to be doing learning. And so firstly, just think back on our last lesson, so when we tried to explain aggression using the cognitive approach, and I want you to try and define the following types of aggression: hostile aggression, instrumental aggression, and relational aggression. If you need to look back in your notes or your textbooks, feel free, but try and do it without. See how much you remember without your textbooks first. So just pause me now and write a brief definition of each of those 3 types of aggression. Okay, so the first one we have is hostile aggression. This is sometimes called reactive or hot-blooded because it's an angry and it's impulsive behaviour. So when something's impulsive, sometimes we haven't really thought it through. It's just that feeling that you get where you just want to punch something. That's hostile aggression. It is accompanied by physiological arousal, so we'll feel an increase in heart rate and blood pressure. And it is often physical, so it will end in physical violence, but sometimes it can be verbal or relational. The next one is instrumental aggression. This is also known as proactive aggression, and you can remember it because the fact that it's called instrumental is because it's seen as using aggression as an instrument to get something that you want. So, for example, bullying is an example of instrumental aggression. It can be physical, verbal, or relational, but it's goal-directed and it's planned. Bullies, when they want to put someone down, it'll be goal-directed and it will be to shame them or to make them feel bad about themselves. And then we have relational aggression, and we can remember relational aggression because it's all about relationships and it's all about damaging these relationships that we have. So an example of relational aggression might be spreading gossip about someone or withdrawing from friendships. This relational aggression can be either instrumental or hostile. It's instrumental because sometimes it is goal-directed or planned, and it might be part of a plan to undermine someone who might have offended you. But then it can also be hostile, so it can be angry and impulsive, like firing off an angry text or social media post in the heat of the moment. Okay, so now we're going to move on to consumer behaviour, and I'm going to read you out a tagline, and then you can either pause me, because I'm going to tell you the answer straight away, so pause me if you want time to try and guess what brand the tagline comes from. So the first one is "Just Do It," which is Nike. "I'm Loving It," McDonald's. "The Happiest Place on Earth" is Disneyland. "There Are Some Things Money Can't Buy, For Everything Else There's" MasterCard. "That Was Easy" is Staples. "Snap Crackle Pop" is Rice Krispies. "Finger Licking Good" is KFC. "Because You're Worth It," that's L'Oreal. And "Every Little Helps," that is Tesco. So I'm sure you all knew, if not all of them, most of them. And I'm sure you can think of so many more taglines from the brands that you use or that you see around. And we're going to look at today why that is. What sort of psychological techniques do advertisers use in order to get people to remember their brands? So it's a really interesting lesson, in my opinion. You might not find it interesting. And it's something that some of you might consider as a career, actually. If you're interested in business, advertising is a perfect blend of business and psychology. Learning objectives today is to understand how the cognitive approach explains consumer behaviour. And don't worry if you're not quite sure what consumer behaviour even means. I'm going to explain that in the next slide. So we're going to look at 3 key terms of the cognitive approach. Number 1 being schema, and number 2 being cognitive priming. So in terms of cognitive priming, we're going to look at subliminal messages that advertisements use, and also brainwashing. And then we're going to look at cognitive biases, in particular confirmation and authority bias. So firstly, what is consumer behaviour? Consumer behaviour refers to how people make decisions about what products or services to buy, and all activities that influence those decisions, including advertising. There are 2 major types of advertising. Number 1 is product recognition. This is so important for advertising companies because they want to make their product stand out, and they want to make consumers very aware of the product or brand or service. So you will have seen, I'm sure, lots of knockoff products of very famous brands, because advertising companies have made brands so recognisable that we'd recognise them anywhere. So if you look at the first picture on your left, Sunbucks coffee, you can see straight away that that's a knockoff of Starbucks coffee, because the branding of Starbucks coffee is everywhere. We're so aware of the branding. And then if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that those are knockoffs of Fanta, Coca-Cola and Sprite, again because we're so used to seeing those brands everywhere. And the next type of advertising is campaigns to change public opinion. So brands and products tend to have a certain stereotype about them, and what campaigns to change public opinion do is they want to change the views of the public about the product or the brand. So if it, for example, if it has like a very female orientated stereotype, then the advertisement might use males in their adverts to say, look, this isn't just for women. Or if a product or a brand has a certain negative attitude about it, then they'll advertise in a positive way to try and get consumers to buy their product. For example, obviously this would never be allowed now, but cigarette advertising used to try to overcome negative attitudes towards smoking in order to increase sales. So they'd use very clever advertising techniques to make smoking look positive. And then if you look at the 2 pictures in the middle, those are 2 examples of campaigns to change public behaviour. The first one, so the one in the middle, the bus, says on the side of it, Guinness is good for you. So obviously alcohol, we all know the effects of alcohol, we know it's not healthy, we know it's not the best thing to drink. So this was a campaign to change public opinion by saying, actually, Guinness is good for you. Gambling behaviour as well can sometimes be seen as a very negative thing. We know a lot of stories about a lot of people who have lost a lot of money, but gambling advertisements are very clever in making gambling seem like a positive thing and like a fun thing, which it can be. Okay, so I've already briefly said some of these key terms, but I'm going to try and think of as many key terms of the cognitive approach as you can. I'm aware we did this quite a while ago, so if you need to look in your textbooks, feel free, but just pause me now and try and think of some key terms of the cognitive approach. So, number 1, schema. This is the very first thing that we looked at in the cognitive approach. And if you remember, it's when we looked at the War of the Ghost story by Bartlett, and schema affected the way that participants remembered the story that Bartlett told them. And they did this in 3 ways: shortening, rationalisation, and confabulation. If you don't remember those, go back and read over your notes. But schema is basically a mental representation of the world around us. If you remember, I described them as little building blocks. So we have building blocks about absolutely everything. So we'll have building blocks about school. So when you start school in reception, then your schema for school is maybe like Play-Doh and sandpits and playing with your friends and snack time and milk time and circle time and all things good. By the time you get to A-levels, your schema has developed in a way that your schema for school is now more developed, and you have more schema about things like stress and exams and assessment. So our schema lets us take shortcuts about information in the world around us. The second one is cognitive priming. And I'm going to talk to you about this in more detail and how it relates to consumer behaviour. And the 3 types of cognitive priming are semantic, repetition, and associative priming. And then we have cognitive biases, which also relate to consumer behaviour. So we looked at things like hostile attribution bias, we looked at confirmation bias. So if you're rusty on any of these, go back to your notes and check over the definitions. Okay, so firstly, schema and consumer behaviour. What is a schema? I want you to pause me and think about it, seeing as I've just given you a definition. See if you can describe what a schema is. A schema is a mental package of knowledge relating to a concept, object, or event. It can also be about people. So in the lesson that we talked about schemas, I asked you to basically assume things about me, because schema formed stereotypes as well. So because I'm a teacher, you might have formed certain stereotypes about me based on your previous schema of teacher. Schemas help us make sense of the world by making it more predictable, and this is true of commercial brands and products. Schemas allow us to take shortcuts in the world. If we had to process everything from scratch every time we hear something or see something, it would take a long time to process any sort of information. So schemas are very useful in helping us make sense of the world. So commercial brands and products do this all the time. They make something very predictable. However, predictability is the enemy of advertising, because we can say things like, oh, once we've seen one vodka advert, we've seen them all. Or like, I think this is very true for perfume adverts. I think all perfume adverts are exactly the same. So we'll be less likely to recall the brand being advertised to us. For example, right now, I can just think of the Keira Knightley perfume advert, but I have no idea what perfume it is because it's so similar to all the other perfume adverts. Therefore, adverts can sometimes try and challenge our schemas rather than confirm them. So they'll put out adverts that are like a little bit more wacky to deliberately conflict our schemas of things. So the 3 examples that I thought of, you might be able to think of better ones, are number 1 is compare the meerkat. So comparison websites tended to all be very similar, and then Compare the Meerkat came out, and it's so memorable, and it challenged our schema of comparison websites because it's so random. Like, why is there a meerkat advertising a comparison website? So we remember it. And if I've ever thought, oh, I need a comparison website just to see this, straight away Compare the Meerkat comes into my mind. Lloyd's Bank, I feel like all their adverts are the same. It always has that black horse. So every time I see a black horse, I will think of Lloyd's Bank, and this relates to something else that I'm going to talk to you about Next slide. And then Snickers. Once you have seen a chocolate bar advert, you have kind of seen them all. But Snickers, I think advertising are very clever. If you haven't seen the Snickers adverts, go watch them on YouTube. It's the one, and the tagline is "You're not you when you're hungry." So it's like people turn into different things, and then they have a Snickers, and then they turn back into themselves. And that's like a really wacky way and very memorable way that conflicts with our schemas of chocolate bars and makes it more memorable. So we're more likely to use their products in the future. So we've looked at schema, and now we move on to looking at how cognitive priming is used in advertising. Quick reminder, priming is when we see one stimulus and that later affects the recall of a second stimulus that we see. So, for example, if we see, this would be repetition priming, which would be if we see the word elephant a lot, then we're more likely to recall the word elephant faster. If we were to see, for example, like a picture of a zoo, then we would recall the elephants faster than the other animals because we've been primed, because we've heard the word elephant so often. There's also associative priming when, like, maybe the word nurse might make us recall the word doctor more because nurses and doctors are associated with each other. And then we have semantic priming and that's all to do with meanings. So words that mean similar things will, if we've been primed with a certain word, then we'll recall words with similar meanings faster. And Yi argued that a key form of priming is the context of an advert. Like any prime, context activates schemas in the minds of viewers, making the product more accessible. And adverts are very clever at making us do this. So they'll give us a whole context around an advert in order to make their product or their brand more accessible. Car adverts are such a good example of this. And because I'm recording my voice over this PowerPoint, I can't show you this video, but I'll post it on Teams so you can have an example of how advertisements have done this. You might be able to think of another example as well, but car adverts in specifically are very good at doing this. So this Ford advert doesn't start with a brand name, it doesn't start with a model, it doesn't even show you a car at first. It shows you people playing basketball at first, and then there's people snowboarding, there's people doing and then skateboarding, there's people doing all sorts of activities, and that is to create the context of roominess or smooth ride. And because of this, those activities like basketball and skateboarding and snowboarding are then associated with the brand name. So when we see basketball or we see snowboarding or skateboarding at a later time, then we're more likely to recall the brand because it's been primed in our brains in that way. So have a look at the Ford advert, and it's quite good. There are two specific things that we're going to look at in terms of cognitive priming in advertising. First one is subliminal messages, and then the next one is brainwashing. So subliminal messages. What is a subliminal message? It's a form of priming below the level of awareness. So we're not even aware that we're receiving these messages, but we are. So a message is hidden within a stimulus that we can detect. For instance, the example at the bottom is an Absolute vodka advert, and the brand name was hidden in the ice cubes. So all throughout the advert, you could subliminally see the brand name of Absolute vodka in the ice cubes, but the viewers weren't aware of it. Another form of voluntary subliminal message is self-help podcasts and video. These claim to contain detectable messages for you to see or hear that will improve your memory or self-esteem, or help you give up smoking or lose weight, etc. But when we're listening to these self-help podcasts and videos, we're not aware of those subliminal messages. It's under our level of awareness. Another example that I found is the Marlboro. So Marlboro is a brand of cigarettes, and when cigarette brands were no longer able to advertise obviously because of the damaging effects of smoking, they found very clever ways to advertise their products. So you can see the racing car has the barcodes on it. That was actually advertising Marlboro, but it was a subliminal message because we're not aware that we're being advertised cigarettes. But if you then later went into a shop and saw Marlboro, obviously now you wouldn't, because cigarettes aren't, they don't have the branding on them. But back in the day, if you then went and bought cigarettes, you'd be more likely to pick Marlboro because you had seen this subliminal message in the F1 racing car. And then the next thing that I want to look at in cognitive priming is brainwashing. So if I just, excuse me, but I'm just going to hum you a little tune and you'll know exactly straight away what it is. If I go do 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 do, you know exactly what that is, and that is a type of brainwashing. We've all been brainwashed to listen to that little tune and instantly think of McDonald's. In the context of consumer behaviour, brainwashing is intended to encourage uncritical acceptance of whatever messages the advertiser wishes to communicate. And they do this by repetition. So there's a central message, a word, a sentence, or an image. So all the taglines that we looked at the beginning of this lesson, that is a form of brainwashing because they've been repeated so often in advertisements and everywhere else that we create an association with a product. So even if someone says outside the context of McDonald's, oh, I'm loving it, you'll instantly think of McDonald's even though you're not talking about McDonald's. It's a very clever advertising technique. Sounds and colours can also be used repetitively. This is a very good advertising technique. Another important one is to appeal to emotions, to bypass critical thinking. So firstly, I want to talk about the colours one. One that comes to mind instantly is Vodafone. Their colour, the colour that they constantly repeat, is red. So even when you go into the store at Vodafone, the people who work there have to wear red shoes. So we've been brainwashed to, when we think of red, to think of Vodafone. An advert that appeals to emotions is obviously the John Lewis adverts, straight away. So we bypass critical thinking in the fact that it basically teaches us that we have to shop at John Lewis if we want to have the perfect Christmas, even though it's very expensive. So it's a very clever advertising technique. And then we have biases and advertising. So the first bias that I want to look at is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when you accept something that fits into your previous beliefs and ignore things that don't fit into that. When we looked at confirmation bias, we used football as an example. So when your team wins, then that strengthens your love for that team, and you're like, oh yeah, that's why I love them, because they're amazing, they always win. And we tend to forget the times that they don't win. Or maybe not, maybe some of you do get upset about it. Consumers prefer to hear information that confirms what they already believe, and this is called confirmation bias. And this explains brand loyalty. Someone who's had a good experience of a product will be receptive to its advertising and may even filter out competing brands. So, for example, I have a great experience of Apple products, so I will never go Samsung. I know there's a lot of people who much prefer Samsung, but I have used confirmation bias to be under the opinion that Apple is the best product. Xbox is another example. My husband has an Xbox instead of a PlayStation, and even though the new PlayStation has come out, he still wants to wait for the new Xbox to be released because he has brand loyalty to Xbox. He's had a good experience of the product. They seek to confirm the decision was correct. This is important in the retail market where consumers upgrade their device every couple of years. But confirmation bias can also be detrimental to advertising, because if you've had a negative opinion of a brand, then that opinion is already formed, and confirmation bias is difficult to reverse. So it can work against a product. For example, Fiat. I used to drive a Fiat and I had a terrible experience because it always broke down. I know loads of people still love Fiat, but personally me, I've had a negative experience with that. So in future I will never get another Fiat. Vodafone, I've had really bad customer service from them. So in future I'm unlikely to go with that provider again. And then the second bias that I want to look at is authority bias. And this is a very clever technique that's also used in advertising. So consumers tend to assign more credibility to the opinion of an authority figure, someone who is likely to be an expert. A wonderful example of this are toothpaste adverts, where they get dentists to explain the benefits of a product, and they'll say, so good that dentists use it. And it does genuinely affect people's likelihood of buying that product. Consumers are very persuaded by authority, even when they suspect the dentist is actually an actor, because obviously they just hire the person with the best teeth to do the adverts for them, I'm sure. Halifax also do this, where they have like colleagues doing the advertising for them, so are more likely to trust in that because it's a person of authority who knows what they're talking about. So that is authority bias. Okay, so that is it for cognitive approach to explaining consumer behaviour. Hopefully you've managed to write all the notes up. What I want you to do is post your notes onto Teams, please. Don't email me the notes, because otherwise it will show up as not submitted. So please, if you go into the assignment bit, there should be a button that says submit, and I just want you to submit the notes there, so I know that you've done them. Any questions or problems, please come to me. I'm happy to help you, and I will see you next week for our live lesson.